March 18, 1945. A meat packer from Chicago's slaughterhouses crouches in frozen German darkness, 6 throwing knives strapped to his body. 40 yards ahead, 8 armed guards stand between him and 23 condemned men scheduled for execution at dawn. The army called his weapon obsolete. His commanders called the mission suicide. But Jack Mercer knew something they didn't. He'd been killing with knives since he was 16 years old, and tonight, silence was the only weapon that mattered. In the next 4 hours, he would do the impossible: eliminate every guard without firing a single shot, free every prisoner, and prove that sometimes the most primitive skill becomes the most lethal advantage. This is the true story of the man who saved 23 lives with nothing but throwing knives and ice-cold precision. If stories like this, the ones history almost forgot, captivate you the way they do me, hit that like button and subscribe. These untold moments deserve to be heard, and your support keeps them alive. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into Jack Mercer's impossible night. Chicago's Packingtown district in the 1930s wasn't a place. It was a smell. Blood, offal, and coal smoke drifted through apartment windows like an unwelcome guest that never left. Men stumbled home after 12-hour shifts with blood crusted under their fingernails and exhaustion carved into their faces. This was where America turned livestock into profit, where fortunes were made on the killing floors, and where young Jack Mercer learned that precision with a blade wasn't just a skill, it was survival. Jack's father had worked the cattle pens for 3 decades before a bull's horn tore through his leg, leaving him with a permanent limp and a disability check that barely covered rent. The message was clear: the stockyards gave, and the stockyards took away. By 16, Jack was following his father's path through the gates of Swift and Company, not because he wanted to, but because Packingtown boys didn't get to dream beyond the next paycheck. The boning line was where Jack found his calling, though he didn't know it yet. Every day, carcasses moved past on hooks, while workers separated meat from bone with knives sharp enough to slice through cartilage, but controlled enough not to waste a single cut. Waste meant money lost. Speed meant quotas met. And Jack, he was fast. His hands learned the language of the blade, the angle of entry, the pressure needed, the exact moment to pull back before going too deep. But it was the 15-minute lunch breaks that changed everything. Behind the main processing building, workers had set up an informal gambling operation. Wooden posts served as targets. Boning knives served as projectiles. Money changed hands based on accuracy. Most men threw for entertainment, a brief escape from the monotony of the killing floor. Jack threw because something about the motion felt right. The weight leaving his hand, the blade spinning through air, the satisfying thunk when it stuck true. He started watching the best throwers, studying their technique. How they gripped the handle, how they adjusted for distance, how wind affected the blade's path. Jack began staying after his shift, practicing on the posts until darkness fell and his arm ached. He'd go home, eat dinner with hands still trembling from exertion, then dream about trajectories and rotations. Within 6 months, Jack was winning more bets than he lost. Within a year, other workers stopped betting against him. He'd developed an intuitive understanding of physics without knowing the formulas: distance, wind resistance, blade weight, rotation speed. Every throw became automatic, his body calculating angles his mind couldn't consciously process. The knife had to spin exactly 2.5 times at 50 feet. Any more, the handle struck instead of the blade. Any less, the angle was wrong. Jack learned to read distance like some men read books, his eyes measuring space with uncanny accuracy. That fence post? 45 feet. That corner? 60. That guard tower across the yard? 70 feet, accounting for crosswind. His co-workers started calling him Blade. The nickname stuck. Jack Mercer became the stockyard legend who never missed. The kid who could hit a target the size of a playing card from distances that made grown men shake their heads in disbelief. But legends don't pay rent, and throwing knives didn't advance careers. Jack remained on the boning line, his extraordinary skill nothing more than lunchtime entertainment. Then December 7th, 1941 happened. Pearl Harbor burned. America entered the war. 3 weeks later, Jack's draft notice arrived in a thin envelope that felt heavier than it should. Fort Benning, Georgia was a world away from Chicago's stockyards. Southern heat replaced northern cold. Military discipline replaced assembly line monotony. But Jack brought his knives, 6 blades. each 12 inches long, weighted and balanced for his throwing style. A Belgian cobbler would later craft him a custom leather bandolier, but in basic training, he kept them wrapped in cloth at the bottom of his footlocker. His platoon discovered his skill during a weekend of downtime. Someone challenged him to hit a tree at 40 feet. Jack did it easily, then 50 feet, then 60. Soon, bets were flying and Jack was performing for an audience of skeptical soldiers who'd seen everything and believed nothing. The sergeant watched once, arms crossed, expression unreadable. When Jack sank 6 consecutive blades into a target at 50 feet, the sergeant shook his head slowly. "Mercer, we got rifles for killing Germans. Save the circus act for the USO shows." But Jack kept practicing. While other soldiers wrote letters or played cards, he found isolated spots to throw, kept his blades sharp, kept calculating distances. The army might not value his skill, but Jack knew better than to let it atrophy. Something told him, a gut instinct honed in the stockyards, that this ability mattered. He just didn't know how much. Not yet. The 69th Infantry Division shipped to Europe in November 1944, pushing through France as winter settled across the Rhineland like a frozen shroud. Jack carried his throwing knives in that custom bandolier, 6 blades that drew curious looks and dismissive comments. His squad joked about them. His lieutenant tolerated them. His captain thought they were ridiculous relics in an age of rifles and artillery. None of them understood. How could they? These men had learned to kill in training camps. Jack had learned in slaughterhouses, where every cut mattered, where precision meant the difference between profit and waste, where the blade was an extension of your arm and your will. The war would soon teach them the difference. And 23 condemned men would owe their lives to a skill forged during 15-minute lunch breaks in Chicago's blood-soaked stockyards. March 15, 1945. The 69th Infantry Division had just liberated Stalag 3C 3 days earlier, freeing over 800 Allied prisoners from the camp near Weiden. The soldiers celebrated. Another victory, more lives saved, one more step toward ending the nightmare. But intelligence officers weren't celebrating. They discovered something that turned celebration into dread. 23 prisoners were missing. Not dead, not escaped. Missing in a way that made experienced officers go quiet when they studied the reports. Captain Morrison called the company together in a commandeered farmhouse that still smelled of the German family who'd fled days before. Maps covered every surface. Reconnaissance photos were spread across a dining table. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. "We've got a problem," Morrison began, his voice carrying that particular exhaustion that comes from bearing bad news repeatedly. 23 prisoners, American and British soldiers, were moved before we arrived. Intelligence tracked them to an SS holding facility 5 miles east. They're accused of escape attempts and sabotage. Someone asked the obvious question, "When do we hit it?" Morrison's expression answered before his words did. "We can't. It's an isolation compound. 1 barracks, 8 guards, surrounded by open farmland. Any assault means we kill everyone inside before we can extract them. Artillery would level it. Infantry assault would trigger executions. By the time we breach the compound, those men are dead." The room processed this in silence. Soldiers understood the mathematics of war. Sometimes you couldn't save everyone. Sometimes the best tactical decision meant accepting losses. But 23 men, alive and waiting for rescue, created a moral equation that numbers couldn't solve. "There's more," Morrison continued, and his tone suggested the worst was yet to come. "They're scheduled for execution at dawn on March 18th. That's less than 50 hours from now. The SS doesn't want them falling into our hands. They know things, camp layouts, guard rotations, weaknesses in their security. The Germans would rather kill them than let us have that intelligence." Jack Mercer stood at the back of the room, listening. Around him, seasoned soldiers shifted uncomfortably, their minds working through scenarios that all ended the same way. 23 bodies and a failed rescue. The captain was right. A conventional assault was suicide. But conventional wasn't the only option. "We need someone who can get in silent," Morrison said, spreading a map across his field desk. "Someone who can neutralize those 8 guards without gunfire, extract the prisoners, and disappear before the SS realizes what's happening." The request hung in the air like smoke. What Morrison was describing wasn't a military operation, it was a magic trick. 1 person, crossing open ground, eliminating 8 armed guards, freeing 24 prisoners, all without raising an alarm. The odds of success weren't just low, they were practically non-existent. Jack's voice cut through the silence. "I'll go." Every head turned. Morrison looked at him with an expression caught between hope and disbelief. "Mercer, this isn't a volunteer mission. This is suicide with extra steps." "Those knives you all laugh about," Jack said, stepping forward. His hand touched the bandolier across his chest, feeling the familiar weight of the blades. "I can drop a target at 50 feet without making a sound. I've done it hunting deer back home. Done it in practice 1,000 times. 8 guards spaced out, working a rotation pattern. I can do this." The lieutenant spoke up, his tone careful. "Jack, we're talking about throwing knives against armed sentries. You'd need perfect accuracy, perfect timing, perfect silence. One miss, and everyone dies." "I know." Jack's voice stayed level, factual. "But those men are dead anyway if we don't try. I've been killing things with knives since I was 16. I know what I'm doing." Morrison studied him for a long moment. The captain had seen enough war to recognize the difference between bravado and competence, between soldiers who talk tough and soldiers who deliver when it mattered. He'd also watched Jack practice, seen those blades sink into targets with mechanical consistency. 3 reconnaissance photos lay on the desk, 8 guards visible in rotation, 23 prisoners confirmed inside the barracks. Execution scheduled for 6 a.m., less than 50 hours away. "Intelligence gives this a 5% success rate," Morrison said. "And that's being generous. You miss once, you're dead. You make noise, prisoners are dead. Guard rotation changes early, everyone's dead. You understand that?" "Understood, sir." "Why?" Morrison asked, and this time the question carried weight. "Why are you doing this, Mercer?" Jack thought of the photographs he'd seen from other liberated camps. Skeletal prisoners staring at cameras with hollow eyes. Mass graves that stretched beyond comprehension. The systematic, industrial extermination of human beings. He thought of his platoon's medic, Thompson, captured during the Bulge. They didn't know which camp held him, but every camp they liberated might be the one. "Someone has to, sir," Jack said simply. "And I'm the only one who can do it silent." Morrison looked at the maps, then at Jack, then back at the maps. The weight of 23 lives pressed against the weight of military pragmatism. Send one man on a suicide mission with minimal chance of success, or accept that those prisoners would die at dawn. "You've got 48 hours, Morrison finally said. "Study the compound layout, guard patterns, approach routes. Intelligence will provide everything we have. If conditions aren't perfect, if guard strength increases, if prisoner count changes, if weather compromises the approach, we abort." "Understood." "Yes, sir." "Then get to work, Mercer. You've got 2 days to figure out how to do the impossible." Jack nodded and turned toward the intelligence table. Behind him, the room remained silent. His platoon watched him go. These men who'd joked about his throwing knives for months, suddenly understanding that the circus act might be the only thing standing between 23 condemned men and a dawn execution. The countdown had begun. 48 hours. 2 days to plan an operation that defied every principle of military tactics. 2 days to memorize guard patterns, study terrain, and prepare for a mission where the margin of error was measured in inches and seconds. Jack Mercer spent those hours like a man possessed. The intelligence tent became his home. Aerial reconnaissance photos covered every surface. Images taken from high-altitude passes that showed the compound in stark detail. 1 barracks building. 8 guards rotating positions. A fence line that offered no cover. Open farmland in every direction. The nearest concealment was a small copse of trees 200 yards away. Jack studied those photos until he could close his eyes and see the compound perfectly. That fence post was 45 feet from the eastern corner. That guard tower stood 70 feet from the main gate. The barracks door faced west, toward the setting sun. Every measurement mattered because every throw would be calculated against those distances. The guard rotation pattern emerged from hours of observation. 2 sentries at the barracks entrance. 2 at the compound gate. For walking patrol circuits around the perimeter. They changed positions every 30 minutes, a predictable pattern that created windows of opportunity and windows of vulnerability. But knowing the pattern and exploiting it were different challenges entirely. Jack needed to eliminate 8 men without a single alarm being raised. That meant each throw had to be fatal instantly. Wounded guards could scream. Dying guards could fire weapons. The knife had to strike in locations that guaranteed immediate silence: throat, heart, base of skull, major arteries. Jack practiced obsessively. Behind the command post, he'd set up targets at precise distances: 50 feet, 60 feet, 70 feet. He threw until his arm ached, then threw some more. The motion had to be automatic, muscle memory so ingrained that exhaustion and stress couldn't affect accuracy. His platoon watched from a distance, their earlier jokes silenced by understanding. They'd seen Jack throw before, but this was different. This wasn't entertainment. This was a man preparing to kill 8 people with primitive weapons, to bet his life and 23 others on his ability to make every blade count. The throwing technique itself was deceptively simple. Grip the handle firmly, but not tightly. Identify the target. Calculate distance, wind, the knife's weight and balance. Arm back, weight shift, forward motion, wrist snap. Release at the precise moment when rotation and trajectory aligned. The blade would spin exactly 2.5 times at 50 feet, presenting its edge at the moment of impact. But simplicity and difficulty weren't opposites. Jack knew that 1 degree of error in release angle meant missing by inches at 50 feet. A slight change in grip pressure affected rotation speed. Wind, even a gentle breeze, could push the blade off course. And he'd be making these throws after crawling through frozen farmland, with numb fingers, exhausted muscles, and 23 lives depending on perfection. So he practiced in conditions that mimicked the mission. Early morning darkness, cold that numbed his hands. He'd run sprints until his heart pounded, then throw immediately, simulating the physical stress of combat. He practiced with wind in his face, from the side, at his back. He threw from prone positions, from crouches, from awkward angles. Every successful throw was cataloged in his mind. Every miss was analyzed, corrected, repeated until it became success. The knives themselves became extensions of his body. He could feel their balance points blindfolded, knew their weight as intimately as his own heartbeat. The meteorology officer provided weather forecasts. Clear skies predicted for March 18th. Temperature near freezing. Light winds from the northwest at 5 to 8 miles per hour. Jack factored those winds into his calculations, adjusting his practice throws to compensate. Intelligence updated the mission briefing twice. Guard strength remained at 8. Prisoner count confirmed at 23. No additional security measures detected. The execution was still scheduled for 6 a.m. Everything suggested the Germans weren't expecting trouble. Why would they? The compound was miles behind their lines, surrounded by open ground, guarded by 8 armed men. What Allied force would risk an assault for 23 prisoners? Morrison found Jack on the evening of March 17th, the night before the mission. Jack was cleaning his knives by lamplight, inspecting each blade for imperfections, testing edges against his thumb. Intelligence confirms the execution schedule, Morrison said. You'll insert at 2 a.m. That gives you 4 hours to neutralize the guards, free the prisoners, and reach our lines before dawn. 4 hours is plenty, sir. Morrison sat down across from him. Jack, I have to ask one more time. Are you certain about this? Once you're out there, we can't support you. Can't provide covering fire. Can't extract you if things go wrong. You'll be alone. Jack looked up from his knives. Those men are counting on someone, Captain. Might as well be me. Morrison handed him a folded paper. Write to your family. Just in case. Jack took the paper and stared at it for a moment. What do you say when you're preparing for a mission with a 5% survival rate? How do you explain that you're volunteering to do something that defies logic and tactics? He wrote 3 sentences. Simple words about duty, about doing what needed to be done, about hoping to see her again. He sealed the envelope and handed it back to Morrison without explanation. Get some sleep, Mercer, Morrison said. You've got a long night ahead. But sleep didn't come easily. Jack lay in his bunk, staring at darkness, running through the mission in his mind. The approach route, the guard positions, the throwing sequences. 8 men who had to die for 23 to live. It was mathematics rendered in blood and steel. At 11 p.m., Jack gathered his gear. 6 throwing knives in his bandolier, each blade cleaned and sharpened to a razor edge. Wire cutters for the fence. Dark clothing treated with mud to eliminate shine. A compass. 1 canteen of water. No rifle. No grenades. Nothing that could make noise if dropped. The chaplain stopped by offering prayer. Jack declined, but accepted a handshake. His squad wished him luck with the careful tone people use at funerals. hopeful but not believing. At midnight, a Jeep arrived. Jack climbed in without looking back. The driver, a kid from Tennessee who couldn't be more than 19, drove in silence through the darkness toward the staging area. By 1:45 a.m., Jack lay in the tree line 200 yards from the compound, watching through the darkness as 8 guards maintained their rotation. His breath came slow and controlled. His fingers traced the balance point of the first knife. The countdown was over. The impossible mission had begun. 2:15 a.m. The temperature had dropped to just above freezing, and Jack Mercer's breath formed small clouds in the March darkness. 40 yards ahead, the compound sat like an island in an ocean of frozen farmland. 1 barracks, 8 guards, 23 condemned men waiting for a dawn that would be their last. The wind cut across the open ground, carrying the smell of coal smoke from the guard towers. Jack shifted his weight, feeling the knives strapped to his body, their familiar weight both comforting and terrifying. 6 blades, 8 guards. The mathematics didn't favor him, but mathematics had never been his strong suit. Precision was. The nearest sentry stood 38 yards away, rifle slung over his shoulder, stamping his feet against the cold. Behind him, 7 more guards maintained their posts, unaware that death was crawling toward them through the frozen earth. Jack began his approach. Movement in open terrain required a specific kind of patience that most soldiers never mastered. It wasn't about speed, it was about invisibility. Each motion had to be calculated, deliberate, and utterly silent. Slide forward on elbows. Pause. Scan for reaction. Breathe slowly. Advance again. The farmland offered almost no cover except darkness and a shallow irrigation ditch that ran roughly toward the compound. Jack used it even though freezing water immediately soaked through his uniform. The cold was instant and brutal, but wet clothes were silent clothes. Dry fabric rustled. Frozen mud crunched. Water moved without sound. His fingers went numb within the first 15 minutes. Jack paused twice to flex them, working circulation back into his hands. This wasn't vanity. This was survival. Without feeling in his fingers, he couldn't grip properly. Without proper grip, the knife's rotation would be off by fractions of degrees. Those fractions meant missing the target at 50 feet. Missing meant screaming guards and 23 executed prisoners. 200 yards doesn't sound like much. A casual walk covers that distance in less than 2 minutes. But crawling through freezing water, moving only during intervals between guard rotations, pausing completely still whenever footsteps approached, 200 yards took Jack nearly an hour. At one point, a guard stopped less than 30 feet away to light a cigarette. Jack pressed himself into the frozen earth, controlling his breathing, watching the cherry glow of tobacco against the darkness. The man stood there for what felt like an eternity, smoking slowly, looking out across the farmland as if he sensed something wrong but couldn't identify what. Jack didn't move, didn't breathe deeply, didn't let his eyes track the guard's movement, because people can sense when they're being watched. He became part of the landscape, just another shadow in a night full of shadows. The guard finished his cigarette, flicked the butt away in a small arc of orange sparks, and moved on. Jack waited another full minute before continuing his advance, heart pounding so hard he was certain the guards could hear it. By 3:15 a.m., he'd reached his first throwing position, a slight rise in the ground 48 feet from the nearest guard. Jack's training and countless practice throws had taught him to estimate distances with uncanny accuracy, and this position was perfect. Close enough for a clean throw, far enough to avoid detection. The sentry stood near the compound's southeast corner, rifle slung casually, blowing on his hands for warmth. He faced away from Jack's position, completely unaware that 6 knives and absolute determination were closing in. Jack drew his first blade. The knife felt cold and heavy in his numb fingers. He flexed his hand twice, forcing blood back into his fingertips, working feeling into muscles that had gone stiff from an hour of crawling through freezing water. The guard shifted position, turning slightly. Jack froze. Throwing at a moving target from 48 feet required perfect timing. The blade would take roughly 1 second to reach its destination. 1 second during which the guard could turn, step, raise his rifle, or simply move enough that the knife struck shoulder instead of spine. Jack waited. Patience was its own weapon. The guard settled into stillness, facing away from Jack's position, focused on nothing in particular. This was the moment. The window between heartbeats when everything aligned. Jack rose into a crouch. His body remembered the motion. Thousands of practice throws in Chicago stockyards, hundreds more in Georgia training grounds, dozens in the past 48 hours. His hand found the knife's balance point automatically. His mind calculated distance, wind, rotation speed. The numbers existed somewhere beneath conscious thought, processed by instinct and muscle memory. His arm came back. Weight shifted from back foot to front. The motion flowed like water, smooth, inevitable, perfect. Arm extension, wrist snap, release. The knife turned twice in the air, blade over handle, completing exactly 2.5 rotations. It struck the guard just below the base of his skull, severing the spinal column. The man dropped without a sound, crumpling to the frozen ground like a puppet with cut strings. Jack was already moving before the body settled. 6 seconds to cover 48 feet. He caught the falling rifle before it could clatter against the ground, easing it down silently. The guard's body lay at his feet, still warm, already dead. 1 down, 7 to go. Jack dragged the body into shadows near the compound fence, working quickly but carefully. Every motion had to be silent. He retrieved his knife, wiping the blade clean on the dead guard's uniform. The man had been young, maybe 20, with a photograph of a girl tucked into his jacket pocket. Jack looked away and focused on the next target. No time for guilt. No room for hesitation. 7 guards still stood between him and 23 condemned men. The night was far from over, and the hardest throws were still ahead. Jack checked his remaining knives, 5 blades left, and moved deeper into the compound. The darkness that had concealed his approach now worked against him. Every shadow could hide a guard. Every sound could be discovery. But silence remained his greatest ally, and precision remained his only advantage. The second guard walked a patrol route along the western fence line. Jack tracked his movement from behind a supply shed, watching the pattern, calculating the window of opportunity. 52 feet away. A longer throw, but still within his range. The guard's boots crunched on frozen ground with rhythmic predictability. Jack waited for him to pass behind a wooden post that would conceal his body's fall. 3, 2, 1. Jack threw. The knife caught the guard in the throat. The man's hands went to his neck instinctively, eyes wide with shock and confusion, but no sound emerged except a wet gurgle. He dropped behind the post exactly as Jack had calculated. 2 down, 6 remaining. Jack crossed the distance, pulled the body fully behind cover, retrieved his knife. The blade was warm with blood. He cleaned it quickly and moved on. The kill count was rising, but so was the danger. Each eliminated guard meant 1 less potential witness, but it also meant 1 less body reporting in during the next rotation check. Time was becoming an enemy as deadly as the guards themselves. Jack moved deeper into the compound, shadows his only cover, silence his only protection, and 6 German soldiers still standing between him and an impossible extraction. The next challenge made Jack's stomach tighten. 2 guards stood at the compound gate, talking quietly in German. They were close together, maybe 15 feet apart, and both were visible to each other. Killing one would immediately alert the other. Jack circled the compound perimeter, staying in shadows, searching for an angle that wouldn't exist. Standard tactics said you couldn't eliminate 2 aware guards simultaneously without firearms. But Jack wasn't working with standard tactics. He was working with throwing knives and a slaughterhouse education. From the northeast corner, both guards appeared in profile, separated by 18 feet. If Jack positioned himself exactly between them, he could reduce his repositioning time. But the distance would be brutal, 65 feet. The longest combat throw he'd ever attempted. Jack positioned himself carefully, 2 knives in hand now. His mind ran calculations automatically. 65 feet meant extended flight time, more opportunity for wind to affect trajectory, more rotation, nearly 3 full spins instead of 2.5. More that could go wrong. The guards continued their conversation, oblivious. Jack caught fragments about the cold, about going home, about the war ending soon. Neither man seemed alert. They expected no trouble in the middle of the night, miles from the front lines, guarding prisoners already condemned. Their complacency was his advantage. Jack took a deep breath. The first guard would be the test throw. If it struck true, the second guard would have maybe 2 seconds to react before Jack's second knife reached him. 2 seconds to process his companion's collapse, to understand what was happening, to open his mouth to shout. 2 seconds wasn't enough time. Not if Jack was perfect. He threw the first knife. 65 feet felt like an eternity. The blade spun through darkness, turning, turning, turning. It struck the guard in the chest just left of center. The man gasped, stumbled backward, began to fall. Jack was already releasing the second knife. His arm burned from repeated throws, muscles screaming protest, but the motion remained smooth. The second blade covered 65 feet in 1.2 seconds, catching the second guard in the throat as he turned toward the sound of his companion's collapse. Both men went down within 3 seconds of each other. Jack sprinted to them, breathing hard, checking for signs of life. Both were dead or dying. For down. For to go? But now he had a massive problem. 2 bodies near the main gate, visible to anyone who looked in that direction. The next guard rotation would come in minutes, and these corpses would trigger an immediate alarm. Jack grabbed both bodies and dragged them behind the guardhouse, working quickly despite exhaustion. Sweat froze on his face in the March cold. His throwing arm ached with deep muscle fatigue. He had 3 knives remaining and 4 guards to eliminate. The mathematics had turned against him. Guard number 5 walked a patrol between the barracks and the eastern fence. Jack tracked him from beside a water barrel, watching the predictable pattern. 40 feet away, moving in a straight line, back turned at regular intervals. Jack waited for the moment, then threw. The knife struck between the shoulder blades. The guard stumbled, made a strangled sound, fell forward. Jack was on him in seconds, clamping a hand over the man's mouth until the struggling ceased. 5 down. 3 guards left. 2 knives remaining. Jack retrieved his blade and assessed the situation with cold clarity. 2 barracks guards stood near the entrance where the prisoners waited. 1 more guard walked a wide patrol circuit around the entire compound. 3 men. 2 knives. The mathematics was simple. He couldn't do it with blades alone. Decision time. Jack could eliminate the patrol guard with a knife, then take the man's rifle and use it as a club on the final 2 guards. Gunfire would alert nearby units. But a rifle, to the skull would be silent enough if executed properly. It was risky. The second barracks guard might shout, might fire his weapon, might alert the entire area. He positioned himself along the patrol route, watching the guard approach. The man seemed more alert than the others, rifle at the ready, head turning to scan his surroundings. Perhaps he'd noticed his companions weren't reporting in. Perhaps he simply had better instincts. Either way, this throw needed to be perfect. 50 feet. 45. 40. Jack waited until the guard's attention focused on the barracks, then threw his second-to-last knife. It struck the guard in the side of the neck, severing the carotid artery. Blood sprayed across frozen ground. The man clawed at his throat, stumbling sideways, but made no sound except wet choking. He collapsed near the fence line. 6 down. 2 remaining. 1 knife left. Jack picked up the dead guard's rifle and checked it, loaded with 5 rounds. He ejected them silently. A loaded rifle was too tempting, too easy to pull the trigger and destroy everything. This weapon was now a club, nothing more. The 2 remaining guards stood 30 feet apart near the barracks entrance. Both faced the door, alert but not alarmed. They had no idea that 6 of their companions were already dead, that death was approaching with 1 knife and a rifle stock. Jack studied them from behind a stack of firewood 40 feet away. Final throw. Final guards. Final chance. The plan was desperate. Throw the knife at the left guard, then sprint 40 feet in roughly 4 seconds, reaching the second guard before he could fully process what happened. The second man could shout, could fire his weapon, could alert every German unit within miles. But there was no other way. Jack gripped his final knife. His throwing arm trembled with exhaustion, muscles screaming from repeated use, cold, and stress. He flexed his fingers one last time, forcing steadiness into his hand. The guard on the left stood in profile, a clear target. Jack measured the distance one final time, adjusted for the slight crosswind that had picked up, and threw. The knife struck the guard in the temple. He dropped instantly, dead before his body hit the ground. Jack was already running, boots pounding frozen earth, rifle raised like a baseball bat. The second guard turned, mouth opening to shout, hand reaching for his weapon. 40 feet. 30. 20. Jack swung the rifle with everything he had left. The wooden stock connected with the guard's jaw. Bone cracked. The man went down hard, collapsing against the barracks wall. Jack stood over him, breathing hard, rifle ready to strike again. The guard didn't move. Jack dropped to one knee, chest heaving, arm hanging limp. Every muscle burned. His hands shook. But 23 prisoners waited inside the barracks, and the extraction phase was just beginning. He'd done the impossible part. Now came everything else. Jack tried the barracks door. Locked. Of course it was locked. Condemned men don't get the luxury of freedom, even the illusion of it. He checked the fallen guards for keys, patting down bodies with hands that shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. The second guard had them, a small ring of iron keys tucked into a pocket beside a half-eaten piece of bread. The lock turned with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the silence. Jack pushed the door open slowly, letting darkness spill out. Inside, 23 men stared at him from the shadows. American and British soldiers, emaciated, some injured, all exhausted. They'd been awake, waiting for dawn and execution, waiting for the end. "I'm Private Jack Mercer, 69th Infantry," he whispered. "We're leaving now. Stay quiet and stay together." For a moment, nobody moved. They looked at him like he might be a hallucination, a desperate dream conjured by men who'd already accepted death. Then a British lieutenant stepped forward, gaunt but steady. "The guards?" he asked quietly. "All 8. Dead. We've got maybe 20 minutes before someone notices they're not reporting in. Can everyone walk?" The lieutenant glanced back at the group. 3 can't. Malnutrition and beatings left them too weak. Jack assessed the situation quickly. The nearest Allied lines were 3 miles west. 3 miles across open farmland with 23 weakened prisoners, some who couldn't even walk. The Germans would discover the bodies soon, trigger alarms, send patrols. This extraction was about to become a running battle. "Pair up," Jack ordered, keeping his voice low. "Strong men carry the weak. We head west across the farmland. No talking, no stopping unless I signal. If we encounter patrols, you drop and stay down." "Understood." 23 heads nodded. Jack led them out into the night. The freed prisoners moved like ghosts, boots careful on frozen ground, breathing controlled despite fear and exhaustion. Behind them, 8 bodies lay in various positions around the compound, testimony to what one man with perfect aim could accomplish. The first quarter-mile passed smoothly. They moved in a loose column, staying low, following Jack across open farmland away from roads and obvious routes. The march cold bit through thin prison uniforms. Several men were shivering violently within minutes, but nobody complained. They understood cold was temporary. Execution was permanent. Jack navigated by compass and moonlight, leading them west towards safety. The darkness that had concealed his approach now worked against visibility, but it also hid their escape. Every step away from that compound increased their chances. Every minute without alarm meant more distance between them and pursuit. At 4:30 a.m., searchlights erupted behind them. Sirens wailed from the compound, tearing through the night silence like screams. Someone had discovered the bodies. The alarm spread across the countryside, lights flickering on in distant buildings, vehicles starting, dogs barking. "Move faster," Jack ordered, voice urgent but controlled. "They know we're gone." The column picked up pace. Men who'd been struggling to walk suddenly found energy born of pure survival instinct. The 3 who couldn't walk were carried by stronger prisoners. The burden rotated every few minutes to distribute exhaustion. Jack pushed them hard across a frozen creek, through a small wood lot, across another field. Behind them, vehicle lights swept across the countryside like searchlights hunting prey. German voices shouted orders. Dogs barked with the specific excitement that meant they'd caught a scent. The pursuit was organized, professional, and terrifyingly close. Jack found a ravine, a drainage ditch about 6 feet deep that ran roughly west. It offered concealment and a route away from the search pattern. "Down there. Everyone down. Stay low and keep moving." The prisoners slid into the ravine without question. Jack had proven himself with 8 dead guards. They trusted him now. They moved through the ditch in single file, boots splashing through icy water, hands braced against dirt walls, every breath visible in the cold air. A bullet cracked overhead, then another, the sharp report of rifles firing from distance. The Germans had spotted their trail, boot prints in frozen ground, disturbed earth, the obvious path of 23 men moving fast. Jack pushed the column forward, maintaining discipline despite mounting fear. "Keep moving. Don't stop. Don't look back." Another bullet struck near them, spraying dirt. Then a burst of machine gun fire that tore through air above the ravine. The Germans were firing at movement, at shadows, at anything that might be escaping prisoners. The ravine ended abruptly at a small road. Jack risked a glance back. Vehicle lights were perhaps 400 yards behind, closing fast. Across the road, a pine forest offered cover, but they'd have to cross 40 yards of open ground in full view of their pursuers. No choice. No time for clever tactics. Just run. 23 prisoners sprinted across the road. Some stumbled, some fell, but they kept moving. Jack stayed behind, watching their backs, counting heads. 20, 21, 22. One man fell halfway across, legs giving out from exhaustion. Jack grabbed him, hauled him up, pushed him forward. The tree line was 20 yards away. 15, 10. Machine gun fire erupted from behind, the distinctive rapid hammering of a German MG-42. Bullets struck trees, spraying bark and splinters. Jack dove into the forest as rounds snapped past his head. He rolled, came up running, grabbed the nearest prisoner, and pulled him deeper into cover. The British lieutenant moved down the line, touching each man, checking faces. 23. All present. They moved through the pine forest at a stumbling run, exhaustion fighting adrenaline for control of their bodies. The trees offered concealment, but the Germans were close behind. Dogs, flashlights, shouted commands. The pursuit showed no signs of slowing. Jack led them deeper into the woods, away from obvious trails, using darkness and dense undergrowth to break up their silhouette. His mind raced through options. They needed to reach the river, the boundary between German-held territory and American advanced positions. Allied lines were on the far side, but the river was still a mile away, and the Germans were gaining. Behind them, dogs bayed with increasing excitement. The scent trail was strong. 23 men moving through undergrowth left traces that trained animals could follow easily. Jack heard German voices coordinating, spreading out, surrounding their position. They were being herded toward the river, cut off from other escape routes. The Germans knew the terrain, knew where escaping prisoners would run. They were driving Jack and his group toward a natural choke point. At 5:15 a.m., they burst from the tree line and saw it. The river, perhaps 40 feet wide, running fast with snowmelt. The water looked black and deadly in the pre-dawn darkness. Allied lines were on the far side. Safety, survival, everything they'd fought for in the past 3 hours. But between them and freedom lay 40 feet of freezing water, moving fast enough to sweep away anyone who tried to swim. And none of these prisoners, starved, beaten, exhausted, were in any condition to make that crossing. Jack searched the riverbank desperately, knowing the Germans were seconds behind them. There had to be a way across. Had to be. Then he saw it. A fallen tree bridging part of the gap. Not ideal, slick with ice and moss, but usable. It was their only chance. Across the log, Jack shouted, one at a time, steady and slow. The British lieutenant went first, arms spread for balance, boots careful on the slick wood. He made it across, turned, held out his hand to help the next man. One by one, the prisoners crossed. Each step was agony, watching exhausted men balance on a wet log above freezing water while German soldiers closed in from behind. The sounds of pursuit grew louder. Dogs, voices, footsteps crashing through undergrowth. The last prisoner was halfway across when German soldiers emerged from the tree line. An officer shouted for them to halt, his voice sharp with authority and anger. Jack grabbed a fallen branch and threw it at the closest soldier, creating a crucial second of confusion. Go, move. The last prisoner scrambled across, fell onto the far bank, was pulled to safety by waiting hands. Jack jumped onto the log, arms spread wide for balance. Gunfire erupted behind him, multiple rifles firing simultaneously. Bullets struck water, churning it white. He ran the final 10 feet and dove off the log onto the far bank. American voices shouted from defensive positions ahead. Identify yourselves. Private Mercer, 69th Infantry. Jack shouted hoarsely, with 23 freed prisoners. Get your asses over here. We've got you covered. Jack and the freed prisoners stumbled into American lines at 5:45 a.m., 15 minutes before their scheduled execution time. Medics rushed forward with blankets and water. A captain was already on the radio reporting successful extraction. Behind them, German forces held their position on the far riverbank but didn't attempt to cross. They'd lost this race. The prisoners collapsed in groups, some crying, some silent, all alive. 23 men who'd been measured for death, now breathing free air. Jack sat against a tree, his throwing arm hanging limp, every muscle in his body screaming protest. He'd used the last of his adrenaline getting them across that river. Captain Morrison appeared 20 minutes later in a jeep. He looked at the 23 men receiving medical attention, then at Jack. "Mercer," he said quietly. "Intelligence said you had a 5% chance. Guess I got lucky, sir." "Lucky?" Morrison shook his head slowly. "Son, you just did the impossible. 8 guards eliminated with throwing knives. 23 prisoners extracted without a single casualty. That's not luck. That's something else entirely." Jack didn't respond. He was too tired for words, too exhausted to process what he'd accomplished. He'd gone into darkness with 6 knives and impossible odds. He'd come out with 23 lives saved and a story that would echo through military history. But right now, all he wanted was sleep. The debriefing began 3 hours later, once Jack had eaten, warmed up, and regained enough strength to speak coherently. Intelligence officers filled a commandeered farmhouse, notebooks ready, questions prepared. They needed every detail while memory was fresh: approach routes, guard positions, throwing distances, decision points. Jack recounted everything. The frozen crawl across open farmland. Each guard eliminated. The moment he'd run out of knives with targets remaining. The desperate sprint when the second-to-last guard turned. The extraction under fire. The river crossing that nearly killed them all. An intelligence major took notes in precise handwriting. "You eliminated 8 guards with 6 throwing knives. How?" "Used the rifle from the 6th guard as a club on the last 2. Jack explained, his voice still hoarse from shouting orders during the escape. "Couldn't risk gunfire. Had to stay silent as long as possible." "The guards' positions when you found them?" Jack closed his eyes, reconstructing the compound layout from memory. 2 at the barracks entrance. 2 at the main gate. 4 on rotating patrols. They changed positions every 30 minutes. Predictable pattern. I timed my approach to catch them between rotations when they were most isolated. The questions continued for hours. Distance of each throw. Wind conditions. How he decided which guards to eliminate first. Why he chose certain angles. How he maintained accuracy after repeated throws in freezing conditions. The British lieutenant corroborated everything. He dropped those guards like they weren't even there. Silent, efficient, professional. Never seen anything like it. We heard nothing from inside the barracks until he opened the door. One of the freed prisoners, an American sergeant from Ohio, added his testimony. "Private Mercer saved my life with a throwing knife. I saw the guards afterward. Perfect strikes, every one. That kind of skill, that's not training. That's mastery." A medic examined the 3 prisoners who'd been too weak to walk. Severe malnutrition, multiple contusions, possible internal injuries. They wouldn't have survived execution. Hell, they might not have survived another week of captivity. The intelligence officers compiled their report in silence, occasionally glancing at Jack as if trying to reconcile the tired, mud-stained soldier before them with the precision elimination he'd executed. 8 armed guards. 0 firearms used. 0 casualties among the prisoners. It defied standard tactical doctrine. The after-action report, dated March 19, 1945, documented the mission's success in clinical language that couldn't capture the impossible nature of what had occurred. 8 enemy guards eliminated without use of firearms. 23 Allied prisoners successfully extracted from SS holding facility. Mission accomplished within 4-hour operational window. 0 friendly casualties. Recommended for Distinguished Service Cross. The recommendation moved up the chain of command with unusual speed. Witness statements came from all 23 freed prisoners, each describing what they'd seen and experienced. Physical evidence included Jack's throwing knives, recovered from the compound by a follow-up patrol. German radio intercepts described the incident as a silent attack by unknown forces, confirming they hadn't identified how their guards were killed. Captain Morrison submitted his own statement. Private Mercer voluntarily undertook a mission with estimated 5% success probability. His exceptional skill with throwing knives, combined with tactical planning and extraordinary courage, resulted in complete mission success. His actions directly saved 23 Allied lives scheduled for execution. Recommend highest commendation. The Distinguished Service Cross citation arrived 6 weeks later, forwarded through military channels from division to corps to Army headquarters. Morrison read it aloud to the assembled company on a spring morning when the war was visibly winding down. For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, Private John Mercer, on the night of March 18, 1945, voluntarily undertook a mission of extreme danger to rescue 23 Allied prisoners scheduled for execution. Working alone and without support, Private Mercer infiltrated an enemy compound, eliminated 8 armed guards using unconventional methods, and successfully extracted all prisoners without casualties. His actions demonstrated exceptional skill, courage, and devotion to duty, reflecting great credit upon himself and the United States Army. Jack stood at attention during the reading, uncomfortable with the attention, wishing the ceremony would end quickly. His platoon, the men who joked about his throwing knives for months, stood in formation, silent and respectful. When Morrison pinned the medal to his uniform, the entire company saluted. The freed prisoners wrote letters over the following weeks. An American sergeant from Ohio, Private Mercer, saved my life with a throwing knife. I watched him drop those guards through the barracks window. Never missed once. My children will grow up knowing their father survived because one man refused to accept impossible odds. A British corporal from Manchester. We'd accepted our execution, made peace with dying. Then this Yank appears like a ghost and kills 8 guards with knives. Thought I was hallucinating from starvation. But he was real, and now I'm alive to write this letter. The mission inspired changes in Special Operations doctrine. Units began training soldiers in silent elimination techniques, not just knives, but garrotes, suppressed weapons, hand-to-hand combat optimized for instant lethality. Success rates improved on similar extractions attempted later in the war. The Wehrmacht increased guard strength at holding facilities, but Jack's mission remained the gold standard. 8 guards, 0 casualties, perfect execution. Military historians would study it for decades, analyzing the planning, timing, and sheer audacity required to pull off such an operation. But for Jack, the mission's significance was simpler. 23 men had been scheduled to die at dawn on March 18, 1945. 23 men who instead walked into American lines alive. The mathematics was clean. 23 lives saved balanced against 8 guards eliminated. He'd done what needed doing, using the only skill that made the impossible possible. A slaughterhouse education had become a life-saving capability. Lunch break entertainment had evolved into precision warfare. And for one night, throwing knives, weapons the Army called obsolete, had proven more effective than any modern armament. The war in Europe ended 7 weeks later. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Jack Mercer returned home to Chicago in November, carrying his Distinguished Service Cross, his 6 throwing knives, and memories of a night when perfect accuracy meant everything. But the story of what he'd done and the men he'd saved was only beginning to unfold. Chicago welcomed Jack Mercer home the way it welcomed all returning soldiers, with parades, handshakes, and the unspoken understanding that civilian life required forgetting what you'd learned about killing. He went back to Swift and Company, back to the boning lines, back to a life measured in shifts and paychecks. The stockyards hadn't changed. The same smell drifted through apartment windows. The same men worked the same positions, minus the ones who hadn't come home. Jack resumed his place on the line, separating meat from bone with knives that felt familiar in his hands, but somehow lighter than the blades he'd carried through Germany. He married Helen, a girl from Bridgeport who worked at a local bakery. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Jack rarely mentioned the war. When asked about his medal, displayed in a simple frame on the living room wall, he'd deflect. Did what needed doing. Nothing special. But the freed prisoners disagreed. Christmas cards arrived every year from Ohio, Manchester, Boston, Virginia. 23 men maintaining contact with the soldier who'd saved their lives. Brief notes about families growing, businesses starting, grandchildren being born. Each card a reminder that Jack's 4 hours of perfect accuracy had created decades of accumulated life. In 1967, 12 of the freed prisoners organized a reunion in Washington, D.C. Jack flew out to meet them, his first time on an airplane, his hands gripping the armrest during takeoff like he'd once gripped throwing knives. They met in a restaurant near the Capitol. Older men now, graying hair and expanding waistlines. But their eyes lit up when Jack walked in. The British lieutenant, now 81 years old and walking with a cane, stood to embrace him. "Jack Mercer," he said, voice thick with emotion. "The man who showed me what's possible when you refuse to accept impossible odds." They shared dinner, told stories, laughed about survival. A photographer captured them together, Jack surrounded by 12 men, all smiling, all alive because of 6 throwing knives and impossible courage. That photograph would hang in Jack's home for the rest of his life. The stockyards closed in 1973, victims of changing economics and industry consolidation. Jack took a job teaching shop class at a local high school, staying there until retirement. His students sometimes noticed the medal in his desk drawer. "What's that for, Mr. Mercer?" He'd take it out carefully, let them hold it, explain what the Distinguished Service Cross meant. "It represents 23 men who got to go home, who got to have families and careers and normal lives. That's what it's for. What did you do to earn it?" "Something that needed doing," Jack would say, then change the subject. The full story remained classified for years. Intelligence operations didn't get publicized while the Cold War raged, but fragments leaked out. Soldiers who'd served with Jack told their families. The freed prisoners shared their accounts. Military historians discovered the after-action reports. By the 1980s, the mission was being taught at Special Forces training schools. Not the specific details, those remained restricted, but the principles. How unconventional skills could be adapted for modern warfare. How sometimes the right tool wasn't the most advanced weapon, but the one matched perfectly to the operator's expertise. How one determined soldier with absolute mastery of his craft could accomplish what entire platoons couldn't. Jack Mercer died on February 3, 1994, at age 73. Heart failure, quick and relatively painless, at home in the Chicago apartment he'd shared with Helen for 48 years. His funeral drew over 200 people. 8 of the freed prisoners attended, old men themselves now, some in wheelchairs, but they came. They formed an honor guard at his casket, standing as straight as age and injury allowed. The British lieutenant, now 98 years old, spoke at the service. "Jack Mercer saved my life with a throwing knife in the middle of the night on March 18, 1945, he said, voice wavering but clear. "I've been grateful every single day since. He gave me 50 more years of life. Let me watch my children grow, meet my grandchildren, see the world at peace." Every sunrise I witnessed was a gift from a meat packer from Chicago who refused to let us die. Jack was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His medals were donated to the Army Infantry Museum at Fort Benning. His throwing knives, the 6 blades he'd carried through the war, were given to his children as inheritance. One of those knives hangs in a display case at Fort Benning today, accompanied by a plaque describing the mission. The knife shows signs of use, the edge honed sharp by countless practice throws in Chicago stockyards and Georgia training grounds. The balance point worn smooth from thousands of grips. A tool transformed into a life-saving instrument through mastery and necessity. Of the 23 freed prisoners, all survived the war, for return to military service, rising through ranks and serving in Korea. 19 went home to civilian life, working jobs, raising families, growing old in the peace their generation had fought to secure. But every March 18th, those who were able would call each other. A tradition that continued for decades, remembering the night a meat packer from Chicago appeared in darkness with throwing knives and impossible courage. The calls continued until the last survivor passed away in 2009 at age 91, taking with him the final living memory of that frozen night. Military historians studying World War II special operations cite Jack's mission as a textbook example of unconventional warfare executed perfectly. German after-action reports, declassified in the 1990s, described the compound attack as precise and professional, methods unknown. They never determined how 8 guards had been eliminated so silently. Modern Special Forces training includes case studies of the mission. Students analyze the planning, execution, and extraction. They study the photographs of the compound, the guard positions, the throwing distances. They calculate angles and rotation speeds. They practice with throwing knives on training ranges, most of them failing to replicate Jack's accuracy even under optimal conditions. The lesson isn't about throwing knives specifically. It's about the principle that mastery of any skill, no matter how unconventional, can become tactically relevant given the right circumstances. That innovation sometimes means looking backward to older methods rather than forward to newer technology. That human expertise, honed through years of practice and dedication, remains an irreplaceable force multiplier. Jack never called himself a hero. When pressed during interviews in his later years, he'd redirect attention to the prisoners. The real heroes were the men who endured captivity, who faced execution with dignity, who found strength to run when freedom appeared. I was just a guy who could throw knives accurately. The war needed that skill for one night. I provided it. 23 men lived because I did. That's all. But it wasn't all. It was everything. 23 men lived, had families, raised children, built careers, grew old, accumulated roughly 1,500 combined years of additional life because of 4 hours on a frozen German night. Each of those men touched hundreds of other lives, spouses, children, grandchildren, friends, colleagues. The ripple effects of Jack's mission spread through generations, creating a legacy measured not in medals or commendations, but in lives lived. On his headstone at Arlington, beneath his name and dates, are inscribed 7 words chosen by the freed prisoners who outlived him. He saved 23. He saved us all. The throwing knife displayed at Fort Benning attracts visitors regularly. Veterans pause to read the plaque. Students study the blade's construction. Historians photograph it for research. And occasionally, someone asks the question that matters most. Could someone do that today? Could a single soldier, armed only with throwing knives and expertise, accomplish what Jack Mercer did? The instructors at Fort Benning give the same answer every time. Maybe, if they practice for 20 years. If they master their craft completely. If they're willing to bet everything on their skill. Maybe then. But there's only been one Jack Mercer. One meat packer from Chicago who turned lunchtime entertainment into life-saving precision. One soldier who volunteered for a mission with a 5% survival rate because 23 men deserved a chance to see another sunrise. His throwing knives, obsolete weapons in an age of rifles and artillery, became the most effective tools of that night. His slaughterhouse education became a military masterclass. His impossible courage became an enduring legacy. 23 men lived because Jack Mercer knew how to throw a knife. That's the story. That's the legacy. That's what happens when mastery meets necessity, and one determined individual refuses to accept that some missions are impossible. Jack would probably laugh at all the attention, deflect the praise, change the subject. But somewhere, in whatever existence follows this one, maybe he knows that his story is still being told. That his impossible night still inspires soldiers, historians, and anyone who believes that individual skill and courage can change the world. Because on March 18, 1945, they absolutely did.